Because it was one of our same points, but I think she was associated with someone else as well. And then just, covering the pieces of it. And I was like, yes, it was a bit harder than
Service in.
I'll put it under the seat. They spelled her name wrong. This is It's kind of quiet. I needed to this
First of all, is it possible, please, your parents?
Yes. Okay. It's under the chair. This is our old stuff.
Yes.
Good. You can get a different picture of all the bunches.
Please.
You should sit next. Sitting between us.
Partner's coming.
Yeah, it sounds
Please sit down. Whoever has to go well. You don't want to join? It's nicer, I think.
I believe his name So you're just feeling something. Oh, yeah. Is there a look? Just that. Okay, it's starting. So quiet.
Clock is ticking. Perfect.
Ladies and gentlemen, and animal, be welcome to the auditorium of the Radboud University for the special occasion of the academic ceremony to the promotion of Saige Rutherford. As usual at this university, we start with a couple of words. Spiriti Sanctia, Gratiae Luminet, Sensus et Corda Nostra. Please take your seat. I now give the floor to the candidate for the degree of doctor.
With the permission of the doctorate board, and in order to obtain the degree of doctor from Radboud University, Nijmegen, I would like to defend in public my dissertation entitled Ethical and Useful Machine Learning for Psychiatry. The core values that guided this work are ethical and useful, hence the title of my thesis. This work bridges several academic disciplines, including psychiatry and neuroscience, and I use machine learning to explore questions grounded in psychiatry and neuroscience. I view this intersection through a critical lens of fairness, accountability, and transparency. Mental disorders are a behavioral pattern that causes significant distress or impairment of personal functioning. And psychiatry is the medical practice of preventing, diagnosing, and treating mental disorders. There are many challenges in psychiatry that make it an exciting scientific area of research. Mental health really remains the only medical domain that depends entirely on the patient's ability to self-report their cognitive, emotional states and their interactions with their environment and the course of their symptoms. And subjectivity is really an intrinsic property based on this definition. Nevertheless, many in the field have been in pursuit of something called biomarkers or brain-based biomarkers. There's been a growing interest in the neuroscience and genetic contribution of mental disorders because these are viewed as a biological, quantitative, objective basis. Standard methods that we use in medicine and scientific research to study and learn about groups of people require very well-defined groups, so we can place people into a group of healthy controls or a clinical group. And doing so allows you to clearly delineate between health and disease. In most areas of medicine, and especially so in psychiatry though, it's very difficult to do this. There's a lot of heterogeneity, or in other words, diversity and variance across people at the level of symptoms. And makes it very difficult to draw a clear distinction between health and disease. This is true at the symptom level, but also at the level of the biomarkers. Using these standard methods, when we look at the brain-based biomarkers, we often look at group averages. So we would take, for example, a group average of the healthy controls and a group average of the clinical group and compare these. Now, in order to find group differences, there has to be clear overlapping signals within each group, and this is called case control testing. In reality, in psychiatry, when we perform this kind of analysis, we're often left with null results or insignificant findings, and it's very difficult to learn something about people this way. This is because, like at the symptom level, the underlying biomarker data also has a lot of heterogeneity and variance across people, and it's difficult to find a clear, distinct signature within each group because everybody's brain is different. In search of better methods than this case control testing, we've often turned to machine learning. Now, there's two types of data in psychiatry at a very high level. On one hand, we have behavior. These are things like our symptoms, cognition, our diagnosis, and also demographics, like how old you are or where you live. On the other hand, we have these brain-based biomarkers, and we use machine learning to learn the relationship between brain and behavior. A very simple example of machine learning in medicine is the idea of growth charts that are used in pediatrics. As children grow, we can map the trajectory of their height and weight. So for example, when my son and daughter were first born, they were very small but very healthy. So at their first pediatrician visit, they were placed into this growth chart. And as they grew, we could measure their trajectory to check that they are healthy and see if there's any deviations that require some kind of intervention. Now we took this framework to the brain. So for the same way that we map height and weight in pediatrics, we can map different features of these brain-based biomarkers. And we did this across many different areas of the brain, measuring different types of anatomy and structure. And we also did this for functional connectivity. And this is the idea of a brain growth chart. Now, this framework existed at the beginning of my PhD, and I really built upon it, so I just want to highlight how that went. The framework really spanned conceptual and technical dimensions. On one hand, the conceptual answered things like, why are we doing this? It was very high-level persuasive, sort of arguing to move away from case control testing. On the other hand, the technical dimension was very concrete and specific, either solving certain mathematical algorithms and modeling implementations or very specific clinical applications. And this growth charting framework was really sort of had a few limitations. It was trained on very small sample sizes, and there was very limited documentation and tutorials, which made it quite difficult for clinical people to get started using these tools. So I really sought to solve that by bringing a practical perspective that united the conceptual and technical dimensions by answering how. How do we do this? How can we actually get started with our own data? And this provided clear, broad explanations and examples. I contributed specifically in 4 ways. First being scale, the second being accessibility, the third being validation, and the fourth being fairness. With regards to scale, I mentioned that the models were initially trained on rather small sample sizes, maybe from just one site. I really scaled these models to nearly 60,000 people, covering the human lifespan from ages 2 to 100. I also expanded the types of brain-based biomarkers that the models were estimated on. So not only how does the brain look in the shape, but also how does the brain communicate with itself, or functional connectivity, also scaling this to a large sample size. The next theme was accessibility. This was really important to me. I really wanted these methods and tools to be accessible to people from a diverse background. Neuroscience and mental health brings people from all types of backgrounds together, not only from engineering and mathematics. So in accessibility, I worked a lot on documentation, documenting every function that exists within the toolkit, as well as providing clear examples of code that are accessible right from this documentation that can be run in a web browser without having to set up any complicated environment. And after creating these tools, I received emails like this from a bachelor student. I couldn't understand this until I read your paper and went through your tutorials. And I thought this was just one of the highest compliments I could receive on the work. The next theme was the idea of validation. There's a lot of downstream analyses that happen after you put data through these brain-based growth charts. And these downstream tasks include things like predictive modeling, whether you're classifying patients versus controls. And because there's an added computational analysis that has to occur by using these models, we wanted to prove that there was something, they were helping you learn something about people, and it was sort of worth the extra effort. So to do this, we compared models, data that did not go through the models versus data that went through the models, so the deviation scores. And when people compare two types of data on some task, they often just look at performance and say, oh, this one is better, without sort of validating it statistically. So in this validation theme, we came up with a new statistic that would show that the data from the brain growth chart, or the deviation scores, was adding value, and it was not just due to luck. We based this in permutation testing. And yeah. The final theme, and this was really the most important to me, but maybe the one I sort of came to at the very end of my PhD, was the idea of fairness. When we measure people deviating from these types of models, we're very quick to assign clinical meaning to this. And I really started to question this. After all, there's many reasons why people differ from each other, and it maybe doesn't always have a clinical interpretation. So I started to investigate this more, look a little deeper into the models, and I learned that a lot of the deviations were due to demographics, not necessarily, we're not interpreting them causally. So it's all a lot of correlation based, and we have to build a little bit more of a causal inference framework at the end if we want to assign clinical relevance to these models. Now, as I mentioned, this was the last part of the thesis, and this is the area that I feel there's the most room to grow and add upon this. It was, something I feel is very important. So to take home, if you remember any messages from this thesis, this work built large-scale models of brain-based biomarkers that capture heterogeneity across populations, yet maintain the ability to understand individuals beyond group averages. Accessibility, validation, and auditing are essential to ensuring that the knowledge gained from this type of work is accessible to people from broad, diverse backgrounds, especially including patients that these models might be applied to. And the third, given psychiatry's sensitive nature and machine learning's trend to scale biases, it's necessary to evaluate their intersection through a critical lens of fairness, accountability, and transparency. And if you really just remember one thing from this work, it's this last point, so it's worth repeating. Given psychiatry's sensitive nature and machine learning's trend to scale biases in existing data and research practices, it's necessary to evaluate the intersection of machine learning and psychiatry from a critical lens of fairness, accountability, and transparency. Having presented the summary of my dissertation, I return the floor to the rector.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rutherford, for this very clear presentation. Thank you. Yeah, ladies and gentlemen, we will start with a opposition in a minute, but before doing that, I will introduce those members of the examination committee that are not involved in the opposition, and I'll explain why. I start with myself. My name is Reuter. I'm a professor of pathology, emeritus that is, and previous dean of the Radboud University, and I'm a chair of this committee. To my left is the supervising team, and you will understand that the supervising team have worked incredibly intensively together with the promovenda in this mean, so they will not take part of the opposition. I start with the first supervisor, that is Professor Malcan, to my left side, Professor of Computational Psychiatry. To his left, it's Dr. Rouhet, and he is Associate Professor difficult to treat depressions. And then the third one is Professor Beckman. Professor Beckman is Professor of Statistical Imaging Neuroscience. So now you know this part of the table will be not involved in the opposition. But now we'll start with the opposition. And the first opponent is the chair of the reading committee. And the reading committee already judged the scientific quality of the work. The chair of that committee was Professor Norris. Professor Norris is Professor of Magnetic Resonance Physics. And the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I should like to start by complimenting you very much on this thesis. I greatly enjoyed it, and I'd also like to compliment your supervisory team. I thought it was outstanding, not just because of the content of what you did, but also because of the reflective way in which you look at things. And it's unusual to see a thesis with quite such an ambitious scope, which of course gives us plenty of scope for discussion. So in the ideal world of normative modelling, there would be some many worlds representation of myself, and then at some later stage in life you could compare me to all my other manifestations and see that I was significantly deviating from this and there was something wrong. And in your quest for fairness, you've started slicing your data, because the data we have to deal with in the real world is, of course, imperfect and comes from many different people with different backgrounds. So just at the sort of meta level, at what stage should we stop slicing? When is it useful? When does it stop being useful? And why did you make the choices that you did in splitting up according to race?
Dear opponent, thank you for the compliment. This is, a difficult question to answer. I think initially when I was scaling the models, that was the primary, it took the bulk of my thesis, was just curating all of the data set. And during that phase, I to be honest, was not really thinking about race. It was based on available data, publicly shared imaging data sets, with the idea in machine learning we want to build as large of a sample, as many people as possible, because we attribute that to better performing models. And that was sort of what guided me when I was first creating these models. And in a lot of publicly available samples, we just don't have race information across a lot of the samples, or it's self-reported race or things. So initially I didn't consider it, and that's sort of in this reflective period when I started to think about it and want to judge, okay, these are probably trained on mostly white individuals and such, but we've never actually really tested how did the deviations perform in different demographic groups. So I think it's always, how you define the reference class is always going to depend on the question you want to answer. So there's not one specific question of whether you should model race in this situation or not. It's really, it depends on what you're looking to answer, and that will guide the reference class that you choose. I think there is some use in sharing these population level samples, but you just have to be a bit more careful in the interpretations when race hasn't been included in those models.
Right. And for example, social economic status is strongly confounded, unfortunately, with race in the Western world. Wouldn't that have been an easier thing to have tested? Did you perhaps test
I did look into that. It's not, you can only fit so much into a paper, but I think especially with self-reported race, when it's not genetic ancestry that you're looking at, race is really a proxy for a lot of things.
Yeah.
Socioeconomic status, of course, being one, and it's a very imperfect metric. I think, the more variables that you can include into the model will help guide your interpretation. So if you can have self-reported race as well as some variable representing education, income, other demographic environmental factors will help guide interpretation.
Yeah, so I'm thinking in terms of it would have maybe given you more power if you could have split your samples more equally between your subdivisions, because you ended up with a very dominant white presence, and then essentially minorities, even some fairly unrealistic splits of minorities in terms of the way you treated Asian people.
It's not ideal to put Indian and Chinese people into the same category, even,
So when you go down to the sort of detailed level, and if this had been working out right, you would have expected, you took two very highly esteemed data sets, the Human Connectome Project and the UK Biobank. Can you perhaps talk me through the figure at the bottom of page 177 as to why we see maybe differences which are larger between the databases than between the races?
So I think in the pre-trained, I guess I'll focus maybe just on the average deviations first. I think the first thing that you see is really that there's, across both data sets, across all three types of models, there's not a strong effect on the white individuals. It seems kind of consistent. And that's really because these models are trained on up to like 98% white people. So there isn't a strong effect. And I see it changes quite significantly for the minority groups whether you include race into the model or not, or if you just are using the pre-trained model. So the main takeaway is just these groups are a lot more sensitive to changes in the model. And changes in the model, if you change one small thing, then the way you're interpreting these deviations changes. So really my main message was just be a bit more careful in how you are interpreting these deviations.
So we shouldn't take these too literally.
Yeah, there's a lot more work that we need to do to be able to assign clinical relevance. I think that's really my strongest message from this chapter.
Okay, I'd love to continue this discussion, but I see that we should maybe move on to the next. Thank you very much for your answers.
Thank you very much, Professor Norris, for taking part in the opposition, also for the work accomplished for the reading committee. Thank you very much. Another member of the reading committee is Professor Huisman. Professor Huisman is professor at Norwegian University of Science and Technology, and he's a professor of pelvic imaging biomarkers. welcome here in Nijmegen, Professor Huisman, and the floor is yours.
Dear candidate, of course I'd like to extend the congratulations that my colleague already gave you, also to you and to your team, of course, because this is a large effort, nice thesis. I also like that it entails collecting a lot of data. You mentioned already in your presentation it's about big data, and I think that's good, definitely with machine learning or AI. And in a way, it also kind of leans towards the benchmarking, which is a topic that I would like to question you a bit about. So you see a lot of AI developments nowadays. ChatGPT, one of the bigger AI models. There's many other models, but they're all, every new version, they are benchmarked, isn't it? They are, oh wow, we're better at programming, or we're better at that, and there's even a number to it. But these benchmarks, if you ask the researchers, yeah, we don't believe that, Henk-Jan, because it's about these models can be trained on the data of that benchmark. So also in my own research, I have a research lab where I've been doing a lot of developments in the last 30 years or so doing AI research, but I'm gradually also more into benchmarking. How do we monitor AI? Because that's very important. So what we did is we sequestered data, test data. We developed Grand Challenge, for example, how to do that, and we can upload an AI model there. And these kind of comes back to my questions, isn't it? You kind of collected a lot of open data, but it's an open database. So if others test their AI on that data, there's a risk that they also see the test data. So how do you see that? I mean, I see a lot of test data, cross-validation in your thesis, of course, all related. But can you comment on that benchmark aspect and how could it be better or could it be different? Or?
Your opponent. Yeah, this is a really important aspect, and I think machine learning, benchmarking is sort of like the heart of machine learning and why it's been so successful, as well as like having open data. There's a lot of talk of, oh, these models have seen all this data before, this is why they're performing so well. The idea of the models I created was to use all of this open data with the idea that most clinical data sets are not openly available on the internet, and so I sort of created them on these large open healthy data sets, and then with the idea that they would be able to be transferred to smaller clinical samples that you can't just download on the internet. Especially working with Eric and some of his clinical samples, that was sort of the initial plan. I've had a lot of people reach out to me and say, I want to apply this to UK Biobank, can you let me know which subjects this was trained on so I don't test them on the same subjects, kind of, for example. So it is, people are still wanting to apply these models to open data sets, which would be a little bit of a violation. So I've had to, respond to a lot of emails about that as well. And I think that's, because we don't have a lot of open clinical samples, it is a problem. I think people, there's many reasons why we don't have a lot of clinical samples open on the internet, for privacy concerns and so forth. But I think that, having more easily data, or just being clear about these are the subject IDs that were in the test set. Like I made that publicly available so that if people wanted to apply them to the data sets that I used, I could, be clear about who was in the test set and such. But I think also at this rate, there's so much new data being shared. I was just on one of the sites for sharing data the other day, and since I looked a few months ago, there's been 30 more data sets shared and things. So I think the best way around it is maybe just having transparency of what data was used and what belongs in the test set and what not.
So I could not convince you to, let's say, stimulate the community to collect a set of data that is really sequestered.
I mean, every data set that I took, I did divide, I split it in half. So sure. Every public data set I split in half. Half was in the train, half was in the test. So I always left some part of the data, even the open data sets, in the test set. Yeah. And I sort of shared models that had a test set left out. And I was clear about what the split was. I've always, sometimes you can't share the exact subject IDs. So I, would respond to a lot of emails about what subjects were in the test. But then I also shared models that were trained on the whole sample for the people that wanted to transfer them to clinical data that it wasn't initially trained on.
Because for me, the use case is that we also, in the radiology field where I'm operating, there's a lot of commercial software, AI software, and they have not the best of incentives sometimes, isn't it? They want to be good, isn't it? So if they can download the test data, they will definitely use the test data and show that they are good at the test data, isn't it? That's what OpenAI does, that's what Google does. So I still cannot convince you.
I mean, I think the goal of these models is it's not as if we search for the most perfect, accurate models, sort of the way some of Google and OpenAI's models are. They're really chasing perfect accuracy, perfect models. That's not necessarily the goal that we have in normative modeling. We want a model that fits the data well and that we can interpret as we want to. That's more of the goal, which I feel is a little bit different from some of the other mainstream AI technologies. Now, I created all these tools around accessibility, sort of created a community space as well, where there's a lot of people that are doing this modeling work now. There's a lot of collaboration. There's a lot of working together. So in that way, maybe there will be more of a benchmarking set that emerges from it, but maybe we just have a lot less data than OpenAI does as well at this time. So we sort of, it's hard to hold out one of our biggest samples or something just for testing, if that makes sense.
I think that will be the last part of the question.
Well, you have time for a short question still?
Short question.
Yes.
Maybe to hop on to the big amount of data that OpenAI has. They also have a different model, isn't it? You use Gaussian processes, which is a machine learning model. There is a lot of deep learning models. OpenAI has a GPT, a deep learning, a transformer model. In your space, there is also a latent diffusion autoencoder. Mm-hmm. I think I saw it mentioned in your thesis once. Could you comment on that? Could that be a model that, if you have more data, could that be better? That it can maybe handle the racial differences? Or maybe the large amount of MR scanners that you have?
Yeah, I think deep learning has many exciting uses, especially in a very high dimensional space. The way we were fitting the models, because we cared a lot about interpretability, we were really using just age, sex, site, and a data quality metric as our predictors. So that's very low dimensional compared to what deep learning, if you input the whole image and wanted to model the image in a multivariate space. So for the way that we had set up our models, because it was relatively low dimensional compared to if I was using the whole image as the predictor, instead of predicting, I'm really just have age, sex, site, Euler number to predict one part of the brain at a time. So that's a relatively simple model that I think I could use deep learning for, but it's just not necessary for that simple of a model. But moving into wanting to, rather than fitting a model for every brain region, if I wanted to model the brain in a more multivariate sense, I think deep learning and the diffusion or autoencoders are definitely useful for that respect. I just didn't get to it in this thesis. But it's exciting for the future.
There's so many developments right now.
Yeah, there's a lot of ways people are fitting normative.
Maybe in half a year we would have had a different discussion already again.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, thank you for your feedback. Well,
thank you very much, Professor Huisman, for your contribution to the opposition today and also for the work you accomplished for the reading committee. Thank you very much. We now move to the next member of the reading committee, and that's Dr. Lurt. Dr. Lurt is connected to us by Zoom. Welcome from the US, from Florida. And you're a professor of physics there. And welcome you to this special occasion, the special ceremony in Nijmegen. And the floor is yours.
Thank you, everyone. I'm delighted to be here. Good morning, Saige. I want to also note that this was truly an excellent thesis. I very much enjoyed reading it. It is one of the most exceptionally well-organized and well-written theses that I have ever read. So I was delighted to read about your work. I want to follow up on one of the first questions. We do indeed know that race in many ways is a social construct. It's a proxy for a lot of different things. Our field is learning a lot about sociodemographics and its impact on brain development, brain function, brain structure. There are a lot more complex socio-demographic and socio-environmental frameworks that really describe how our life experiences influences us at, let's say, for example, the individual, the family, and the neighborhood level. More comprehensive frameworks to think about the social determinants of health and how they interact together in a hierarchical structure. You note in your thesis that many data sets that are available out there, the open data sets that you use, really lack diversity in participant demographics, but they also lack variables and metrics that capture some of those more complex sociodemographic variables. So I'm curious to know, and this is just thinking about the future and perhaps what's next for normative mapping, what would an ideal data set look like to you when considering that balance between participant burden, getting them to answer questions, understanding their lives, their lived experiences, and getting the neuroimaging data and putting that together in a cohesive package? And how could you think about modeling these more hierarchical frameworks, again, individual, family, neighborhood level? How could that be incorporated into normative mapping?
Hi, Angie, dear opponent. Thank you for the very kind words about my thesis. I think I answered this in my head like almost on a daily basis when thinking about the future of normative modeling. And sometimes I wonder if the best model is just a longitudinal model of one individual over time. Sort of the best reference class is you without a disease or something. Now that requires a lot of, I don't think necessarily with neuroimaging we could, have enough data from one person to build these types of norms. So maybe it would be with smartphone data or some other type of data that's more easily collected. I think that's one interesting future direction that, we wouldn't then have to deal with, different demographic variants if the models were always within the individual. But there's a lot of challenges that come with that. There's also, I think, there is room for having these large models that we don't necessarily know the very specific demographics of them. If, the law of large numbers, if the model's big enough, we would hope that it would sort of just reflect the population demographics. And by definition, minority groups are always going to be a smaller group of the population, except women, maybe. So I think ABCD is starting to point in the right direction. They've really partnered a lot with people that have carefully studied sampling and how to collect representative data sets. But, often it's sort of an afterthought, and it's really hard within these large consortiums that collect data at scale to come to a consensus on what you want to collect. Even now within the ABCD sample, you start to see they're changing some questionnaires. They now can't answer things about or ask things about racism experiences because of the political situation in the US right now. So there's not a perfect answer, but it's something that I'm happy to see people putting more thought into, what data do we need to collect to represent these experiences. I think it's really just happened in the last 5 years or so. And unfortunately, it's often an afterthought, not always from the start. And again, it's hard to come to a consensus, and you only have so much time and money. But you see it as well with a lot of the phone visits and questions they can answer at home. That's not all you can only fit so many questions into a 2-hour visit for 10-year-olds or things. So yeah, there's not a perfect answer, but I think asking diverse groups of people what they need to represent themselves also is an interesting line. Including patient lived experiences and how do you feel yourself represented in these questions that you're answering, or is there something else that you need to communicate to us about your environment, your symptom courses, and so on and so forth. So long answer, but yeah, it's a hard question.
Do I have time for a follow-up?
Yes, please.
So another aspect that I very much appreciated that I'm not sure gets talked about a lot is the starting point, the synthesizing data and data analyses from different data sources. There are a lot of challenges in data accessibility, interoperability, harmonization of variables from different data sets. Can you say a little bit about those experiences? And this is really just in the logistic challenges of data use agreements and everything then that flows forth from there. And do you have any recommendations for making that aspect of the work easier, more simplistic, something that can be accomplished by more groups, but yet also while maintaining high data securities and respecting participants' privacy?
Yeah. To your opponent, I think that this is sort of like the overlapping variables that you have when compiling all these samples are why I ended up with models that only included age and sex. When you whittle down what's overlapping, everybody, even if they measure cognition, they choose a different instrument that's not the same. So it sort of does narrow you down to have these simpler covariates that you can include. At least we have those two. But I think that in terms of accessibility, often people share just like the final last step of their analysis where everything is perfect, and the cleaning of the data and organizing data is honestly the hardest part. That's 95% of the work. So I've always tried to share in like a interpretable manner every script I use to bring together different sources of data. I always share those scripts and include them when I'm sharing the end result. I think that's a step that more people are starting to do, but, especially when not everyone has a background in software engineering, it can be sometimes nerve-wracking to share your messy data scripts or things. But I think we've made a lot of progress, as well as within the community of neuroinformatics. There's just been so many tools that have been shared in terms of how we organize data. That's really exploded in the last 10 years or so, or even the last 5 years. There's a lot of tools that sort of follow a standard format and are helping, shape these legacy data sets into this sort of more standard format, and that's helped a lot. But there's still, more work to be done in that regard. And regarding privacy and sharing, I think that's sort of why we have some data sets that aren't just, immediately like you can log onto the internet and download them, that you have to, have a data use agreement for as well. But also, which is important to protecting privacy and things, but also there's a huge administrative burden on individual PIs and things that, at one institute at the Donders, maybe there's 10, ABCD data use certificates. That's also not necessary. So there is a balance with that as well. I think just ongoing collaboration and communication across people that are using these data sets will help. I think that's my best answer.
I'll just quickly note that ABCD is releasing a new data platform, and Saige, you might be interested in knowing that the initial administrative goal was for having every user to have their own data use agreement, not even organized by labs or universities anymore. We very quickly talked them out of that.
That's good to hear. That's good to hear.
All right. Thank you so much for the opportunity to ask questions. I'll let you move on to the next person.
Thank you very much, Dr. Laird, for taking part in the opposition from the USA, and also your work accomplished for the reading committee. Thank you very much. We now switch to another opponent by Zoom. That's Professor Van Tol. She is from the University in Groningen, and she's professor of cognitive neuropsychiatry there. Welcome, great that you could join this meeting, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Dear candidate, it's a pleasure for me to be part of this defense ceremony. I'm very sorry that I can't be there in person, but this is maybe a situation that comes close to the lockdown situation during which you spent many hours of cleaning and checking the quality of your data. So luckily, due to COVID, we have these perfect online options. So, but that's not what I want to talk about, of course. I want to talk about your impressive thesis. I really enjoyed it. I learned a lot from it because I think not only you did really thorough scientific work, but also really thorough teaching. And I appreciate that a lot, that you really try to lower the boundaries for people not known to these methods to start using them. And I think you did a fantastic and impressive job there. I want to start my question about the reference group or the normative group, so to say. I think your work also shows that we really have to think careful, either if we do just a clinical versus healthy control, what does this control group actually look like? And I was a bit puzzled how to deal with this in the context of the RDoC framework, in which you rightfully state that it's not so much about this clinical diagnosis, or you're in this group and you're in that group, but about variations on certain domains of functioning. For example, the domain of not showing initiative or motivation related to abnormalities in the positive valence domain, for example. And I was curious a bit, if I would like to study that, for example, in clinical populations, how should then my normal reference group look like if I don't use any boundaries of who should be in the reference group or not? And so how to deal with this, to study this variation on the positive valence domain, while also taking into account the variation in all these other domains. Could you teach me some more?
Dear opponent, thank you for the kind words. I'm happy to hear that you learned something from my thesis. That was certainly a goal of mine. I think specifically for RDoC, if you wanted to study this, so backing up first, it's very difficult to define health across any field of medicine, but especially so in psychiatry. The labels that we give people it's not fixed. I think we're really starting to see that, even if you're assigned a label of having, psychosis or schizophrenia, it's not necessarily true for the rest of your life. So there's a dynamic nature to the labels that are assigned to people that we need to have tie in more to this problem. With respect to RDoC, if you wanted to model this, I think you would set some threshold of, okay, within this range, I will determine this is healthy or not clinical. I have a hard time using the word healthy, but non-clinical. And you could include that as a variable in the model that you estimate, and then you would have your patient group that is above or below this threshold that you set on positive valence in your test set. And I think you would assume that when you put them into the model, they would deviate above the healthy or the reference cohort. That would be sort of a simple way to do it. I think, as you state, it's a really hard problem to solve. There is no perfect reference class, and we sort of have to take these definitions as fixed, even though we certainly know they're not. But when you want to get started and create a model, you have to plug things in and define things in a certain way. So I then lean more towards just being a bit more careful in interpretation and communicating what deviations mean. It might be suggestive of a clinical reason, but just weighing, the interpretation of deviations in a more careful manner is really important.
Yes. And do you then also, like you did for the gender differences, see room for kind of subclasses of norm groups? For example, people with a history of a certain clinical or at least mental health problems that cause them to function less in life for quite some while. Would that be an option?
Yeah, I think these models could serve as some interesting initial screening tool. Okay, we find that this group of people is deviating. Why? Then there needs to be a follow-up to investigate why. Maybe then they go into a clinical trial or something. It's a sort of an initial screening that leads to further investigation. That's as simple as I could put it.
I have another question related to what your reference model or reference group that you built your model on looks like. And I'd like to, just like Professor Norris, point to the sample you used in chapter 7. So on page 172, for example, for the UK Biobank sample, you have a very low number of people of non-white racialized identity in the training group. What if these people, for example, all were older and men? And what if the people in the testing set were all younger and female? So my question is, how important is the covariance or maybe the intersectionality and the difference therein between your training and your testing sets? Could you comment on that?
Yes, that's, dear opponent, that's very important consideration. If you're training on a set of 80-year-old men and applying it to a set of 20-year-old women, you would certainly expect there to be huge deviations because there's a demographic mismatch between the reference class and the sample that you're applying to. So this is really the idea of the reference class problem and taking more time to consider for who I will apply these models to, have I defined the proper reference cohort? And that's not a fixed answer. It's always going to depend on the setting and the questions that are asked. But I just think there's been a lot of push to just scale the models, create a bigger sample, which in some areas is important and should be done. That does, you have a higher explained variance. But does that matter if, you're interpreting deviations incorrectly then? Maybe not. So I think there just needs to be much more thought into, based on who I'm applying the model to and who I want to measure deviations for, have I, to the best of my ability, based on the available data, matched the reference class to that population. And I would not recommend applying a model trained on 80-year-old white men to 20-year-old diverse women. It would certainly lead to improper interpretations.
But would you then recommend to also report on the relationship between your demographic or covariate matrix? And I don't know if you do that. I did not read it in the thesis, but do you think that's also an important quality aspect of saying this is a good training set for this testing?
Yes. Transparency is very important. I don't think we'll ever have perfect representative samples. So being transparent about who makes up the reference class is a very important step. Sometimes you're not able to because you just don't have the available data, as I did in some of the models. I did not have, information on income, genetic ancestry, and so on to really give a full description. I was limited to just age and sex, so that's what I reported. But I think you should be transparent about the demographics of your sample as much as you can be.
Thank you. I think my time is up. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Van Tol, for taking part as the opposition from Groningen. Thank you very much. Now we come back here in the auditorium, and the next opponent is Dr. Bron. And Dr. Bron is from Rotterdam, Radboud of the Erasmus University. And she's an assistant professor of neuroimage analysis and machine learning. Great that you could come. Welcome to Radboud University, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rector. Dear candidates, so happy to be here, and congratulations on your finishing your thesis, your great work, and also congratulations to your supervisors. I think your thesis was very well written and a pleasure to read, and I especially enjoyed your insightful considerations in your introduction and your discussion, and also made me reflect on my own research, so very well done. And in the light of that, I would like to start with some more technical question, and in particular, chapter 4, where you provide some practical advice for researchers that want to do normative modeling. And one of the things you advise there on is how to set up the experiments, basically. And one thing you say is you discourage cross-validation or resampling the training and test sets. Could you explain why that is your recommendation?
Dear opponent, thank you for the kind words. Cross-validation is obviously an important aspect of machine learning, and it is funny to hear that it's not recommended because it's how you often get confidence intervals and such. But when you're going to share a model that's publicly available for people to use, and you want to make it as easy as possible for clinical people to use, if you're having a cross-validated model, you could then have 5 models that you're sharing, and it wouldn't be clear about which would be the right one to use. So that's why we still did cross-validation in the sense that we had just a single train test split that could be thought of just, n of 1 fold cross-validated, to sort of show that in a test set, we performed this way. But when you want to go to share this, I think it would be rather confusing to share 10 or 5 different models. So it was really more recommended in when you're sharing these models with people to use. In that sense, that I think
Okay,
cross-validation can make it a bit more complicated for people.
So
to
your
use.
recommendation is limited to the setting where you want to share, but for model development, especially when
Yeah, if you want to
developing-
know the stability of the model, especially if you have a very small sample size, does the model change based on if these 10 people were left out? That would sort of indicate that you don't have a stable model and maybe you need to include more data. I think cross-validation is important in the realm of, much smaller sample sizes. I think when you're approaching 60,000 people, we did test in the supplement, we did cross-validation. A reviewer asked for it, and we showed there was essentially the model was, the evaluation metrics were exactly the same across tenfold validation because the sample size was so large.
Okay, happy to hear that you agree with me that in many settings you do still need some resampling. And then the next question that I have is on chapter 7, where you do the important work that was already mentioned, how to incorporate the racial groups into modeling. And then if we go to the figure that was also already discussed, so figure 2 on page 177, there is some difference in the normative model scores between racial groups. So I was wondering whether, so what you used as a imaging biomarker is the cortical thickness of different regions. And I see you only use age and sex in your models and not, for example, head size or intracranial volume. Could that be partially explaining the difference between groups?
That could definitely be, dear opponent, that could definitely be a consideration and should have been checked a bit more, perhaps. I guess I would expect race to be quite correlated with head size, and there are models that had race included in the model, and I was still noticing, sort of these strange group differences and patterns across demographic groups. In the race included, which is the final row of each data set, I still am seeing sort of, like group differences. But certainly I could have investigated that further, and I definitely.
But you haven't.
I have not looked
investigated
at,
yet, no.
intracranial volume or things. A lot of other normative models I've seen have, and yeah, that certainly should be done in the future.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of room to tease apart why are these group differences happening. And the goal of this work was not necessarily to show that there's differences. It's really just to show that there are differences here because of race, and we need to unpack it a lot further. It needs a lot more analysis than I could perform in one paper.
No, indeed, yeah. So good that this might be a future effort then, because indeed you found the biggest differences, I think, in the motor cortex. And I also found that that's one of the regions of the brain that has the strongest correlation to ICV. So may definitely be something to look into. And then a more general question. So in your thesis, throughout your thesis in multiple places, you strongly advocate for regression, right? And move away from the paradigm of classification. So would you say that there is still room for classification in brain image analysis or disease prediction? Or should we stop doing classification at all?
Dear opponent, I think even in my own work, there was still classification and group difference testing was performed. So I don't advocate that it should be stopped completely. I think there's, this ideal that we want to move towards of having, all of our data represented based on, the RDoc framework or things that, it's very difficult to put people into groups. But sometimes it is helpful for interpreting our data. But I think the more we can move towards a fluid regression-based framework, even for things such as gender, the better. And sort of refining all of the ways that we put people into boxes. There'll never be a box that everyone fits into. And I think just having that in your brain when interpreting group difference testing or classification, it's important to remember that categories is always going to be a huge simplification of the person sitting in, that is being put into this model. It's not that there's not something that can be learned, and especially as like a triage, is this person healthy or not? Are they it's one screening tool, but it will always be a huge simplification of that person, and I think it's just important to remember that.
Okay, clear and agreed. And then I give the word back to the director.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bron, for taking part in the opposition and for coming from Rotterdam from this special occasion here to Nijmegen. Thank you very much. The final opponent is Professor Hazelager. He's from the Faculty of Social Science from the Radboud University, and he's a professor of societal implications of artificial intelligence. Professor Hazelager, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Dear candidate, I want to echo all the positive remarks that everybody already made and add one to it regarding your thesis. I very much sincerely appreciate the willingness to self-criticize, to criticize your methods, your assumptions, the suitability maybe of this tool of machine learning for this particular domain. And so it's out of respect and appreciation that I want to ask you a very critical question. What would you say if someone, me for instance, would have read your thesis and said, yes, I agree, you've convinced me. Machine learning in this domain is not useful, and continuing its usage would be unethical. What would your reply be?
Dear opponent, I would say that I understand and respect that opinion. I think I stand by that.
It's not the answer that I expected, I admit, but I appreciate the frankness of it. So the title of your thesis is Ethical and Useful Machine Learning for Psychiatry. And let me, with all due respect, again, I assure you of that, further emphasize this a little bit. So, for instance, you speak of the high-level concerns. The challenges, this is on page 212, the challenges most commonly raised include poor generalizability and accuracy of models, unrealistic sample size requirements, low reliability of brain and behavior measurements, the lack of validity of clinical phenotypes, inconsistency of behavioral brain phenotypes across public data sets, inadequate interpretability and neurobiological plausibility, poor methodological practices, which has a long list. Why is your last sentence not, we should stop, we're barking up the wrong tree? Machine learning is a very important tool. We use it in a variety of domains, but psychiatry is just not one of those domains.
Okay, so my answer, I guess, was thinking of a psychiatrist sitting in an office saying, I don't want to use machine learning. I would respond, I understand that. It's at this time maybe not that useful to you yet. That doesn't mean I don't think scientifically we should keep improving it. And I think machine learning is an important tool for understanding complexity, mapping heterogeneity, building a better understanding of the brain across health and disease. And we have a lot of work in front of us in that regard. I think that's one area that's not the main area of psychiatry, that's treating people sitting in front of them. I more am hesitant to see the use of machine learning in the clinic in psychiatry at this time. I don't think that it will never be useful, especially as a screening tool to try to map out maybe which patients would respond better to a certain treatment or things. I have hope that we'll get there. I don't think we're there at this time. And so I think there's been a lot of hype and excitement and overpromising technological solutions in healthcare and in psychiatry. So that's where I sort of jump on the, balancing that a little bit. I believe in machine learning to solve useful problems in psychiatry and medicine, but I also see a lot of the problems, and I don't want to overpromise solutions. I don't feel it's ready to be used in the clinic at this point. I don't see enough people focusing on the ethics and critical auditing to make sure that it's ready. This is an incredibly sensitive domain that we're working in. And I think when people have been very excited to use it, they tend to forget how sensitive the domain is. We're working with people's inner thoughts, and it's a very sensitive area. So I really have felt there's a need to have a bit more critical view of it. And honesty and transparency. It doesn't mean I don't think it will never get there. I just think there's a lot of work to be done before it's ready to be in the clinic.
Ora est.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Hazelager, for taking part in the opposition. It's very great to have philosophical questions at the end of the opposition, because it makes us think further and further. Thank you very much. We now go back to the protocol. The defense is hereby concluded. I give the floor once again to the candidate.
Having defended my dissertation to the best of my ability, I would like to thank you, Rector, and my supervisors, and all who have honored this ceremony with their presence.
The Doctoral Examination Board retreats for its deliberations.
Can be still 2 minutes, you never can tell, so take your time.
I don't know. Thank you for taking
And you don't give some because that whole video.
I know. I just see my mom is 89 and I don't know if she's going to live long enough, so I'm sending it to her. Yeah. We'll give her this. I just, yeah.
It's really nice to see you. Yeah, sorry. And then you use that. No, wait. I was in here.
Yeah, exactly.
Which never happens.
Not yet.
On behalf of the Doctorate Board of Radboud University Nijmegen, we have decided to award you the degree of Doctor. I invite Professor Marcon to discharge the task assigned to him. Please.
With the power entrusted by law to the Doctorate Board, I hereby confer upon you, Saige Elizabeth Rutherford, born in Ann Arbor, the title of Doctor from Radboud University Nijmegen, to which are attached all associated legal and customary rights and duties with respect to academia and society. As proof thereof, I present you with this doctoral diploma signed by the rector and the doctoral thesis supervisors.
Doesn't feel real.
The laudatio is being delivered by Professor Marcon. Please sit down.
Dr. Rutherford, dear Saige, it's a pleasure and a privilege to be the first to congratulate you on this wonderful occasion. It's been quite a journey, a new continent, a global pandemic, getting married, 2 children and 1 PhD later. The world looks a little different now, but also kind of the same. Right from the first time we met, it was clear to me that you were a talented young researcher and would thrive given the right opportunity. So we set about trying to convince you to come to the Netherlands. However, I must say this impression was not shared by our university, who was quite stubborn and insisted that you couldn't do a PhD unless you did a master's degree first. It's pretty clear from the work you've presented today that our initial impression was correct and that the master's was totally unnecessary. There are many memorable events that I could talk about during your PhD. The first being that you surprised me by still wanting to travel to the Netherlands in the middle of the COVID pandemic. Also, despite being locked down and deprived of the social interactions that you might have, you and Charlie, who's here today, coped amazingly well, which I think is a testament to your fortitude. Even more than that, you took it upon yourself to derive creative ways for everyone in the team to socialise, which I appreciated and I think others in the team did too. You also got to work straight away and told me within the first weeks that my code was way too hard to use, my documentation was terrible, and that I should write better comments so that other people could use it too. Actually, you were right about that. Throughout your PhD journey, you've done a really good job in developing tools that are useful and ethical. And I think one of the main reasons that our software is used all over the world is because of the efforts you put into improving the usability and understandability. I hope it is as satisfying for you as it is for me. Steve Jobs once remarked that he wanted to make a dent in the world. And I think it's fair to say that you've done that. At one of our first meetings, we had a meeting to talk about personal goals, and I was expecting to hear some scientific goals. Instead, you told me about your yoga goals, and one of your personal goals was to be able to do a handstand. I won't ask you to do one now. You're also the only PhD student I've ever supervised who insisted on introducing me to her mother for the final approval of the suitability of this person from the other side of the world to supervise her daughter. About halfway through your PhD, I remember you contacting me, asking for a meeting to talk about something important. I actually knew already what you were going to tell me, and I had to keep a very serious-looking poker face while you told me that you'd started a relationship with someone else in the team, Thomas. This was followed shortly by another serious conversation to tell me that you'd broken up. Then another one, that we're back together again. Then another one, that we were going to have a baby. Then another one, actually it's not one baby, it's 2 babies. Well, I think you'll be able to write a book about all the things that you've done and all the things you've overcome during your PhD. I'm sure your kids, if they were here today, would be very proud of you. And they will be one day. I know it's not all been plain sailing, and there have been bumps and difficult conversations along the way. To your credit, you have a very open and direct style of communication, sometimes very direct. I remember multiple occasions early in your PhD where I'd receive a 2-page message via Slack, usually between 9 and 10 p.m., that would start something like, Andre, I want to push back on what we talked about today, or I've got to get something off my chest. Usually I'd wait till the next day to respond. Throughout it all, it's been a lot of fun. We've achieved a lot together. I would count you as not only as an excellent student, but as a good friend. I'll miss having you around, and you'll always be welcome here if you'd like to come back. I have no doubt that you have a prolific scientific career ahead of you, and I'm really pleased things worked out for you in taking the next step in your career. I'm sure any lab would be happy to count you as one of its members. On behalf of Eric, Christian, and myself, I'd like to congratulate you once again on an excellent job and a wonderful achievement today. And I'd like to ask everyone in the room today to join me in congratulating you once again.
Thank you very much, Professor Marcan, for these fine words. Yes, young Dr. Rutherford, because so it's the way I like to address you. I also would like to congratulate you on behalf of Radboud University with the achievement of this academic degree. And not only with the achievement per se, but also for the way you accomplished this. You did a very good job. We heard this from Professor Marcan, also from the opponents. You developed new techniques and you gathered lots of data and so forth and so forth. And also the way you defended your thesis was excellent. So you were not a very good scientist, but you're also an excellent teacher. And we like to see that in the academic world. And that's also a very good ammunition for your further career. So I would like to congratulate you again with this success today and wish you all the best for the future. Also would like to congratulate your partner, your spouse, and your family, your mother, because she is special, I heard. That we met before this meeting, and she said, "I look of that you would look like her," and that's correct, and that gives an extra bondage, probably.
Yes.
Okay, that's. I think that was the words I would like to say to you, but there are two other colleagues that would like to congratulate you because they are connected to us by Zoom. And I would like to give the floor to Dr. Laird to congratulate you. Dr. Laird, may I ask you, please?
Thank you so much. Hi there, Saige. I want to say again what a remarkable and impressive thesis that this was. I am personally delighted to know you, and I'm very excited about today. I'm deeply appreciative of your careful thinking and your dedication both to improving what we know about the world of psychiatry and to openly sharing what you have learned with others and the tools and resources that you've developed. I look forward to watching your career unfold and seeing the strong impact that you will have on the world around you. So I'm very happy to congratulate you today. This is very well deserved. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Laird, for this congratulations. By the way, I also noticed a dog in your room. We also have one in the auditorium. That's unique.
We've got dogs, we've got kids, we've got here.
Yes, thank you very much. Then I would like to give the floor to Professor Van Tol to congratulate our young doctor. Professor Van Tol, please.
Yes, Dr. Rutherford, congratulations. Thank you for writing this excellent thesis, for your great defense. I wish you a great day. I hope you look back on it with great pleasure and pride, and that you will also enjoy your career in combination with all other important aspects of life.
Thank you very much, Professor Van Tol. Ladies and gentlemen, we now come to the conclusion of this ceremony, and I would like to ask you to stand because we will close by the following words. Gratias tibi agimus omnipotens Deus pro omnipotens beis beneficiis tuis, qui vivas et regnas per omnia saecula saeculorum.